Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melody Ju. I'm professor of literature and environment at UC Santa Barbara, and I'm happy to welcome you to a panel called Seaweed Figures, Perspectives in the Arts and Humanities. This panel examines the visual, narrative, and ecological histories of seaweed from perspectives in the arts and humanities. Speakers will present their research on topics that include 19th century paintings of seaweed gatherers, photographs of US military photographers in Japan, California aquaculturists in the 1960s and 70s, and ecologies of seaweed restoration. The talks each explore different senses of the word figure, so seaweed as an iconic figure, photographic or painterly subjects, and scientists as figures in these larger histories. The panel also traces histories of why different people have been interested in seaweeds, and these reasons include national security, environmental remediation, indigenous cultural resurgence, colonial romanticism, and more. So I'm very happy to introduce for our first speaker, Dr. Sol Lee, who is Associate Professor of Art History at Stony Brook University, and her talk is entitled Seaweed Gatherers as the 19th Century Global Visual Cultural Trope. Please join me in welcoming Sol.
Thank you, Melody, and thanks everyone here in the audience. I'm really excited to present this material. All right. So as many of you know, about 98% of edible seaweed consumed in this country is imported, right? And about 70% of all globally consumed pyropia, or better known as nori in Japanese or kim in Korean, is produced in South Korea. So as an art historian, it was not a surprise to find visual cultural motif of seaweed gatherers in both Korean art and Japanese art. But it was a surprise to me to find that in Atlantic visual arts of the 19th century also had this subgenre of seaweed gatherer. So today, what I want to do is present a part of this larger project that I'm doing as an art historian to investigate the relationship between art and ecology by tracing seaweed. And in this talk I'm focusing only on the visual trope of seaweed gatherers, people who are gathering seaweed. So Clement Swift is an American artist who followed the international trend of being stationed in various artist colonies in France at the time. One of the most famous ones is Barbizon in south of Paris. The other is actually spread across like a cluster of artist colonies spread across in La Bretagne on the coast. So he's depicting in the realist manner hardworking peasants who are hauling an oxen cart filled with seaweed, kelp. They're following someone that's more famous, someone like Jean-Francois Millet, who also painted seaweed gatherers. This is an archival file that I found at the Getty in Los Angeles during my scholar residency earlier this year. Millet is obviously famous for painting peasants in the field, working hard, often in these very soft brush strokes with sort of the light glowing. There are other North American born artists who also went to France to pick up this peasant motif of seaweed gatherers. And the most famous artist of 19th century French realism is Gustave Courbet. He's known actually for being part of the Paris Commune in 1871, and oftentimes in our history, we consider realism's connection with Communist Manifesto that was published in mid-19th century, as well as kind of a slew of literature by Dickens and Blake and Ruskin about pollution in both France and other parts of Europe at that time after Industrial Revolution. So if we come back to this particular painting, we then need to think about, according to several art historians like Greg Thomas and Mara Coughlin and Naomi Slip, the fact of pollution industrialization that was not included in this pictorial space, right? So the fact that in Brittany, by this time, the peasant population was, yes, harvesting seaweed, gathering seaweed for the consumption of iodine. So they were burning seaweed to produce ash that will be used in glass production. But by this time, late 19th century, it was highly industrialized in a way that there were factories who are doing most of the work, rather than individual peasants in a more kind of like workshop system. So what the picture does not show is as much important as what it shows for a lot of art historians today. And 19th century is also when Charles Darwin published on the origin of species, right? And also with the importance of ocean in Darwin's work, there were other literatures and interests in marine ecology springing around the late 19th century. And in Brittany, people were also using seaweed for fertilizer in addition to extracting iodine. If we come back to East Asia, where we currently have lots of aquaculture, seaweed aquaculture, so this particular documentary painting is in the genre of 풍속도, meaning everyday documentary folk painting. Here, people are harvesting kombu or kelp. And this genre is, in fact, something that can be called as export painting. So by this time, Korea was opening up to rest of the world. First, there was a treaty made in 1876 with Japan, and then later on, US, France, and then also British Empire, they all arrived with military ships to force Korea to open its market. So the paintings by Kim Gun-jun, which we have about 1,500 of in various parts of the world, were in fact for export purpose. They were painted to be sold to foreign eyes. Therefore, this particular one is found in Germany today. They were sold mostly in a box, in a set of 100 leaves. So it was showing images of everyday or special rituals like wedding ceremony or riding a swing on a particular Tano day in May. This follows the earlier tradition, 18th century tradition of documentary folk painting, where elite painters like Kim Hong-do would paint everyday life scenes for elite audience, Korean elite audience, not for foreign purchase. And here, what we see is like very delicate facial expressions, either frowning or laughing at a classmate. So Schadenfreude in the Korean style. But in Kim Gun-jun's 19th century painting, in fact, shows something that is not usually shown in the 18th century everyday painting, which is the punishment scene, something that was popular among foreigners to learn about Korea. So what I'm trying to do here is to analyze the artistic context of these images of seaweed gatherers in different locations. Hokusai is one of the most famous ukiyo-e maker, so pictures of floating world in the Edo period Japan. Edo period Japan had different types of themes that they really liked, one of them being courtesan. So the seaweed gatherer is posing as both courtesan and also seaweed gatherer. If we actually look at another work by Hokusai, we can also learn about the popularization of everyday scenes amongst the Japanese consumers. So by this time, in Edo period, there were a lot of highways that were built across Japanese archipelagos, and tourism was developing, domestic tourism. So each region with specialty, like specialization is particular help or particular abalone, in this case, making salt from seaweed by burning seaweed. And the album includes poems actually from, in this case, a 13th century, right, about seaweed. If we go a little bit farther to late 19th century, however, in the Meiji period, here we have Hiroshige III's 1877 ukiyo-e of kombu in Tsugaru location. And this particular print was actually part of a set made for the first Universal exhibition that was staged in Japan. So if you can recall 19th century history, Universal Expo, World Expo is a platform where the most up-to-date industrial products were shown as much as fine art. And this is also a time when Japan forced Korea to open its port, beginning of Japanese imperialism. I found another photo at the Getty during my scholar residency there earlier this year, which is by American photographer taken in 1903. So this is 7 years before Japan annexed Korea. Now, seaweed gathering has been blooming as an industry, colonial industry, to export seaweed to the colonial metropolis, right? We see mound of seaweed. So 19th century art history requires a careful exploration of this genre, ethnographic photography. Here we have American photographer Edward Curtis taking photos of seaweed gatherers in Haida, so current day British Columbia. And this is another photo actually from Hawaii. It's early 20th century seaweed gatherers as well. So if art history needs to transmorph itself to help us understand art and ecology, reality and ecology today, and climate crisis, what can we do to reread these images? That's the question that I will leave with you today. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to be taking questions at the very end after all four panelists. Next, we have Joe Riley, who is an artist, historian, and PhD candidate at UC San Diego in the Visual Arts program and environmental research program with Scripps. And he'll be presenting on capturing seaweeds, photographs of seaweed cultures and economies during the post-war U.S. occupation of Japan.
So maybe moving a little bit further up from Sol's talk into a little bit the mid-20th century. I'm going to be talking a little bit about seaweed in the context, or representations of seaweed in the context, and seaweed gatherers in the context of the post-war U.S. military occupation of Japan. And so what you're seeing in the background here is a video of a collection of photographs that's held in the Scripps Institution of Oceanography archives, which I stumbled across a couple years ago. And the collection includes numerous photographs of ama divers or Japanese freedivers who, for centuries, harvested seaweeds and shellfish all around coastal Japan with little more than capacious breathing and expert technique. And through their direct relationship of being in touch with seaweeds and their watery environs, ama developed and maintained a deeply held cultural and as well as scientific knowledge of seaweeds. And I was really struck by the photographs of ama, like some of the examples you see here, and particularly moments in which the images show how and where knowledge and practices of seaweeds gathering also became an object of military research. These images, this video should be playing continuously, but I'm going to blame Microsoft for that, for it not working. But the images were all made by a U.S. military officer named Claude M. Adams, who's seen here entering Yokohama Harbor in 1945. He was among the first military personnel to arrive in Japan with the occupying force. Adams was assigned to lead the fisheries division of the military's natural resources section and was tasked with jump-starting commercial fisheries and the production of aquatic products in Japan. So what contexts and agendas shaped the creation of these images of ama and seaweeds? In 1942 to 43, the U.S. military launched a civilian affairs training school at Stanford University, and it was aimed at preparing soldiers to occupy Germany and Japan. Adams took part in the school. He studied Japanese language, geography, customs, and cuisine, and received mostly B grades on his final exams. When I was working in the Stanford archives, I came across dozens more military photographs of fishing, of harvesting seaweed, and other Japanese maritime practices. Some of these are actually surveillance photos that were procured during the war. And here's an example of from the archive of workers loading dried seaweeds onto railroad cars under the watchful eye of a uniformed guard or officer. So why was the US military so interested in documenting traditions and practices of harvesting seaweed in Japan? The simple answer has to do with a substance that's made from a seaweed that I'm sure many people are familiar with called agar. Agar's a remarkable material that's made from red gelidium seaweeds and long associated with Japanese culinary traditions since at least the 17th century. Beginning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, agar was used as a growth medium for culturing bacteria in scientific laboratories and was a precondition for producing many medications, including penicillin. Japan was once leading up to World War II, was the world's primary source of agar. And then as the war unfolded, that agar became increasingly scarce in the West. In 1941, the US War Production Board designated agar as one of its many critical war materials and restricted the use of agar specifically to the war effort. And so absent a sufficient stockpile of agar, Allied forces might be left without antibiotics and other medically necessary cellular cultures. And so that was the main kind of military concern. The urgency of these shortages really rose and became more acute with the tide of war. And scientists, perhaps most importantly, the Chinese phycologist C.K. Seng, who we can see on the far right of that image there, was charged with developing US domestic sources of algal war materials. And seaweed scientists sort of tapped into a dormant kelp potash manufacturing industry in California, and sought to help avoid a complete collapse of the agar supply. They fell short of replacing pre-war levels, and at its peak, U.S. domestic production of agar in the mid-20th century amounted to about 75 metric tons. By contrast, Japan's pre-war annual export of agar had reached a total of 2,476 metric tons. So from 1946 to 47, Claude Adams, I'm getting a little bit behind myself or ahead of myself. He toured Japan and surveyed the re-emergent agar industry, taking photographs that trace the seasonal patterns of agar production. This process typically begins in late summer and fall when lingering warm weather could help to dry out the gelidium that was harvested by AMA. Workers spread layers of collected wet matter over raised platforms, carefully turning and slowly desiccating the seaweeds in choreography with the sun. Once dried and cleaned, the seaweeds were boiled and eventually thickened into a gelidium jelly. And that coagulate would be strained and cooled, and during that process, the algae's long-chain polymers crystallize into the ordered molecular structure that really underwrites agar's versatility and materiality. Adams tracked the semi-processed agar from the coast up into the mountains, where the material was dehydrated during winter months through cycles of freezing overnight and thawing during the day. And photographs from this stage of the process show workers wearing winter caps and coats of the Japanese Imperial Army, a uniform. And they're also removing, in these images, the final product from wood form molds and to pack it up eventually for shipment and export. In written reports, Adams emphasized and marveled at the fact that little to no mechanical equipment or expensive ingredients or fuels were used in the production process. And because of that, he thought that this industry was particularly primed for the occupation's economic drive and also its capacity to tap into a plentiful low-wage labor supply. So the occupations, or the US military's occupation model for changing cultural and economic formations in Japan can also be seen in Adams' other assignment, his parallel assignment, which was to find a quick fix to a compounding food crisis and insufficient supplies of protein. Adams and the National Resources Section initiated a program to expand Japanese whaling for the first time into the waters of Antarctica. Although there was a Japanese whale fishery prior to the war, it was relatively small and primarily a coastal affair. And the new whaling industry that the US military launched was hindered at first by shortages of vessels and fishing gear. And although whale meat eventually promised to stock shelves and supply, importantly, school cafeterias all across the country, its prospects for profitable export as a commodity were still quite dim. On the other hand, a material like agar was ready to go and a profit-making industry, largely because of its continuity that was sustained by AMA and other seaweed workers and gatherers. And that dynamic is how, as I like to say, the occupation became somewhat preoccupied with seaweeds and particularly the people who gathered and processed them. I think I mentioned earlier that seaweeds were already central to Japanese cuisine and maritime culture and to industries that remained largely intact throughout World War II. And during the war, AMA, who traditionally worked in seasonally active cooperatives, to harvest seaweeds, had been pressed into year-round collecting of vast amounts of kelp to produce potash to manufacture gunpowder and fertilizers and other materials. By 1947, the agar industry had made a tremendous rebound with nearly 600 agar-producing plants operational in Japan. On the other hand, the first post-war whaling expedition wouldn't return with its desired catch until 1948. And the photo on the right here shows the celebratory dinner for the first post-war Antarctic whaling expedition that was put on by the occupational force. Adams really, throughout this time, channeled an occupier's gaze that sought the satisfaction of touristic fantasies while also simultaneously fixating on the exploitation of seaweeds as a modal material for the benefit of US geopolitical interests. In the 1940s, it's estimated that there were over 10,000 professional AMA divers active in Japan, and today that number probably looks more like several hundred working within the tradition, predominantly within the tourism industry. This is an outcome, I would argue, that speaks to the visual cultural legacy of the post-war occupation and how the Pacific would be politically and environmentally reshaped by post-war tourism. In this photo that's mixed in with the archive of AMA and seaweeds, we can see Adam standing in front of a large sign that's shaped like a broken arrow, and it marks the location of Ground Zero, or the detonation of the atomic bomb site in Nagasaki. The photograph is a souvenir of bomb site tourism, an industry with roots in occupying soldiers' visits to the restricted sites of atomic destruction. And the Adams photographs are very much a product of a similar conflation of sightseeing and sea life in the immediate aftermath of atomic destruction. So the force of a military occupation assured that seaweeds were commodified and transformed into growth media, filling countless petri dishes. And throughout this history, I think that we can see that gelidium-based material in so many foods and at the bottom of so many petri dishes is not, in a historical or political sense, neutral matter. Thank you.
All right. Questions again will be saved for the end. Up next is Keenan Chan. Keenan is a marine ecologist and freelance photographer based in California, and his presentation today is entitled Monitoring California's Changing Kelp Landscape.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keenan Chan. I'm a marine ecologist here in Southern California. I study both the rocky intertidal and subtidal regions off the Channel Islands. I'm going to change things up a little bit here and kind of talk about both past and current monitoring of kelp forests here in California, hoping to piggyback off the previous talks and set up for David's next talk. So a brief history. So for centuries across the world, people have been collecting kelp for many reasons. They've collected ascophyllum to bring up on the rocky shores of Ireland where there was no soil and create soil from this. They would use fucoids to help create fertilizer. And here in the US, beginning in the 1900s, it was used for things like potash and fertilizer and eventually agar, as Joe mentioned. But in the 1950s, here in Southern California, a scientist by the name of Wheeler North started investigating the kelp forests here. And so he consulted for a company called Kelco, who was commercially harvesting giant kelp here in Southern California, particularly in San Diego. And Kelco was concerned about the loss of kelp in Point Loma. And so they tasked Wheeler with determining why the kelp was declining in these regions. And so he determined that as a result of several factors, kelp was declining, mostly because of pollution as a result of the sewage outfall, but also to a degree the El Nino that was happening around that same time. So really early kelp forest monitoring came about because of commercial interest in the kelp declines. Now, however, kelp forest monitoring is done less so because of commercial interest and more for environmental interest, as well as the economic impacts associated with the ecosystem services provided by the kelp forests. Kelp loss now also differs from that in Wheeler's time, where now we see the degradation of kelp mostly due to warming waters and some of the impacts of grazers. So in 2013 and 2014, we saw sea star wasting disease hit the West Coast here, and that virtually wiped out the population of sea stars. Sea stars are an important predator for sea urchins, and sea urchins are an herbivorous animal that you can see here that have the potential to clear-cut kelp forests. And fortunately here in Southern California, we have other predators like sheephead and lobster that helped prevent as dire of a situation that the Northern California coast saw, but we certainly saw losses here as well. Additionally, around the same time as sea star wasting disease, we experienced a couple of warm water events. So we saw a warm water blob and an El Nino. And so these warm waters really degraded the kelp. Kelp prefers this cold, nutrient-rich waters. And so this kind of series of compounding events really led to the decline, the rapid decline of kelp that we've seen up and down the coast now. Just to kind of show some of the value in monitoring, let's look at kelp canopy coverage. And to do that, let's look at Point Loma in San Diego. So as you can see in green here, this is the historic kelp coverage in 1911 by a guy named Wesley Crandall. And so now let's compare that to 1989. 1989 kelp coverage, 1989 was generally regarded as a good kelp year. And so that's kind of in this yellow zone over here, yellow-gray, as you can see. Now, obviously we've jumped quite a few years, but the important thing to see is that the range still spans kind of that entire Point Loma area. Okay, let's jump to 2016. So you can kind of see a few of these little orange blobs. And 2016 was regarded as a poor kelp year. It was after the sea star wasting disease and after the warm water events. And so, you know, the difference is staggering, right? In 1989, the kelp coverage was about 1.9 million square meters. In 2016, it was about 7,000 square meters. So big changes happened, and so really this kind of highlights the importance of monitoring. It's allowed us to track these changes beyond what we as humans might otherwise be able to kind of see with our own timescale. I wanted to dive into the difference between monitoring and restoration. Many of you have probably listened to some talks today already about restoration, and you know, it's been in the headlines a lot. And so really the difference between monitoring and restoration is restoration involves bringing kelp back to areas where it once existed. There's also afforestation, where we're bringing kelp to areas where kelp didn't previously exist. And that's typically done in the form of like artificial reefs. But monitoring, however, does not involve the altering of ecosystems, but it is typically done in conjunction with these restoration practices. I'm not going to talk about the restoration practices, but at the end, I'll put up a QR code that has a link to more information on that if anybody's interested. So why do we care? Why do we want to monitor the kelp forests? So for one, there's legal mandates. So there's several reasons why people are required to monitor kelp forests or other ecosystems. We want to learn the environmental impacts due to human activities, or it could be for construction projects or monitoring various initiatives like California's marine protected areas. So, with the marine protected areas, we want to know, are they working? Are they too small? Are they too big? Are there too few or too many of them? With monitoring, we're also able to track fishing stocks. So some of you might have already done your lobster diving this year, but monitoring allows us to ensure that those populations of commercially viable species are still healthy for people to collect. We also are able to track disease outbreak and incursion of invasive species. So getting early information on these is really important for scientists and other policymakers to make decisions. But finally, long-term monitoring, I think, is arguably one of the more important values of monitoring. So when a project goes from a monitoring project to a long-term monitoring project, we're able to see through a whole different lens. So we might look at a data set that's 5 years. Then we can look at one 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. We can look at a data set for those 5 years and see that a species is doing really poorly, it's declining. But that same species, if we look at maybe a 40-year data set, it actually might kind of ebb and flow. And so the reality is, it really gives us a better picture when we do these kind of long-term monitoring. Okay, and who's doing this work? So there's a whole bunch of different groups, and it's a mix. You have universities, government, private, and even citizen scientist organizations doing this. From the university standpoint, I just picked a few for examples, but PSCO, they have a group in UC Santa Barbara and UC Santa Cruz, state, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, federal Channel Islands National Park, and citizen science, you have Reef Check. And if anybody here is a certified diver and interested in helping do this type of work, they can look to their local Reef Check chapter to get trained and participate in their local waters. Okay, and then how are we doing the work? So there's a whole litany of various monitoring protocols that we use, but most of them do involve diving. While underwater, we count size, sex, age, speciate species. We will do this for fish and invertebrates and algae. Additionally, we're starting to see more remote sensing data being used, and that's through the use of drones or satellites. This is obviously by no means comprehensive or detailed look at the type of monitoring that we do, but I'm happy to get into the nitty-gritty later if people are interested. Okay, and with that, I'd like to thank you and invite you to reach out to me with any questions. And as promised, I've included the QR code to some various restoration projects happening in the state. Thank you.
Okay, and last but not least, we have David Stentiford, who is a lecturer in the Department of English at Cal Maritime Academy. David's presentation is entitled Staying in the Loop, How Kelp and Other Seaweeds Became Figures of Ecological Degradation and Renewability in the 50s and in 1960.
How's it going, everyone? Okay, I'll be talking about, my talk has 3 chunks. I'll set up a problem and then talk about a solution, and then I'll show you some examples. Okay, so part 1, I'm going to talk about soil nutrients and some intellectual history about environmental thinking in the mid-20th century. I'm going to talk about the figure of the ocean farm in the second part of the talk. And third, I'm going to show, that's the show and tell portion where I'll talk about algal systems. Okay, so let's begin. So in 1948 and 49, 3 books were published that mark a major shift in ecological thinking in the United States. These were Fairfield Osborne's Our Plundered Planet, William Voigt's The Road to Survival, and Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac. Much can be said about these texts. They're problematic in many ways, but I want to mention just 2 ideas. First is that these ecological critiques of modernization mark a change in focus from local and national concerns over resource conservation to a global analysis of the ways in which materials and energy circulate. And soil was a big part of this story. Soil conservation, soil fertility, and the limits of agricultural productivity were headline items for these authors, writing with the crisis of the Dust Bowl still in recent cultural memory. Okay, and this is kind of my point. In all 3 of these texts, readers find a common narrative. Agricultural soils were being depleted through farming processes that produce surpluses to be sold in far-flung markets. Consequently, soil nutrients were no longer circulated within local economies. You grow the corn in one place, you send it somewhere else, your soil is kind of going somewhere else. Okay, so likewise, tilling and cropping practices were leading to soil erosion, and the productivity of soils were running downhill, so to speak, ending up in rivers, lakes, bays, estuaries, and the ocean. So it's my claim that in these years, an image of a global and globalizing ocean was taking shape, one in which ocean basins were figured as the main sink of terrestrial productivity. Quote, the great reservoir of decay, as one later ocean booster came to call it. So here's a quote from another ocean booster, F.G. Walton Smith, an oceanographer and the editor of Sea Frontiers. This is from 1955. Quote, the sea is a great reservoir into which rivers bring the products of erosion and decay, the mineral runoff of the land. Here is a particularly limitless source of all the minerals and metals we use, but in great dilution. Okay, so the farms are running into the ocean. Vogt, Osborne, and Leopold are often associated with an intellectual return to the English economist Thomas Robert Malthus, whose an essay on the principle of population from 1798 argued that increasing populations could not lead to greater national productivity and prosperity because the humus, or the soil fertility, was fixed, static, and providential. So as populations grew, he reasoned, increasing marginal agricultural land came under the plow and overall productivity declined. Malthus's political agenda emphasized the moral restraint of population increased, aimed at the poor. He's a baddie. And he was also writing before the analytical work on soil chemistry had been established in the 1830s, which specified that particular nutrients limited plant productivity, a fact that opened up a historical horizon of industrial agriculture. Malthus thinks the soil's fixed. After the 1830s, people say, no, it can be improved. That's the point there. So these ecological writers in the 20th century, Vogt, Osborne, and Leopold, they update Malthus's argument with greater scientific precision, but their conclusions were similar. Growth economies, even with the importation of critical nutrients, would inevitably run up against hard ecological limits. That's one side of the debate. So progressive commentators, however, were more optimistic about the capacity of human enterprise to overcome these hurdles through the application of scientific methods to agriculture, the Green Revolution. So 2, okay, ocean farms to the rescue. So let me introduce you to one of these progressive commentators, James Rorty. If we got any philosophy fans in the audience, this is Richard Rorty's pops. Okay, and so Rorty was arguably one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. And this is his dad, not like father and son. Okay, so James Rorty was suspicious of Malthusian arguments since his intellectual tradition formed in large part as a radical critique of classical political economy. In 1949, criticizing Vote. So Vote's book was really, really popular. It was like a Reader Digest monthly edition, and so he's criticizing this. And Rorty pointed a way toward a more productive future in a short essay called Food or Famine. And there, Rorty argued that the ecological limits could be improved and food production increased to meet growing demand. And he identified three frontiers which held promise. First was food yeasts, which could be mass produced to deliver essential proteins without losses in efficiency of animal agriculture. You might have put nutritional yeast on your popcorn. Think of that. Okay, and second, he thought that phosphate fertilizers could be improved to make more efficient use of these materials. And third, Rorty called for ocean farming to bring a new domain under production to overcome shortages on land. If the soils were headed to the sea, why not extend agriculture to the marine environment? Rorty set the stakes high, and here he is at the end of the essay, which is shown on the left. He writes, "Considered merely as spectacle, our present moment in history has a kind of Miltonic grandeur. By constructing a single global ecology at the highest technological level, we can banish hunger from history. Mankind can be as gods. Or alternatively, in the epilogue of some unimaginable atomic or bacteriological Armageddon, the residual human life can try again in an era of primitive peace and quiet." So the takeaway here is that ocean farming would in part produce a unified global and industrial ecology. I'm going to skip a little bit, but this is really indebted to cybernetics. I could talk more about that later. Okay, so here's one more story and then some examples. I'm coming to my end. Maybe I'll skip this. Okay, no, it's too good. Okay, in January 1958, the Oxford Lions Club gathered for a lecture given by officials from COPCO, Incorporated, one of Southern California's industrial kelp companies. COPCO was in business to harvest Macrocystis pyrifera, giant kelp, transforming it into various products. Here's a quote: "We call ourselves sea farmers," COPCO's general manager, B.R. Dunwoody, explained. Quote, "The sea farmer takes from the sea what the sea took from the land," end quote. Kelp's utility was that it allowed COPCO to reclaim minerals lost to rainfall and irrigation runoff. So club members learned that COPCO harvested his farm. Okay, I'll skip this bit. Okay, so at the end of the club session, they served them bread fortified with nutrients from kelp. Okay, finally, I have just a minute left. So the project looks at three systems. I'll introduce you to these briefly. Three algal systems that were designed to sort of close these loops between land and sea. So this is John Ryther, an oceanographer of great importance, and he was working on something called controlled eutrophication. And so this project mirrors the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture systems we saw earlier, except there was one big difference. The input of nutrients here came from human municipal sewage. So you would be able to plug these aquaculture systems into cities. And what you would do is you would grow a crop of microalgae using sewage, and then you would sort of use trophic arbitrage, moving between tanks to feed critters and grow food. So you would grow plankton, then you would grow shellfish, you would grow worms, finfish, and at the end of this chain, you had Gracilaria, and Gracilaria would slurp out all of the excess nutrients and return polished water that was cleaner than the local bays. So this was the synthesis of wastewater treatment and human food production. It was an Ouroboros. Okay, I'm out of time. It's hard to sell oysters grown in sewage. The other thing I focus on is something called the Ocean Food and Energy Farm Project, which imagined quite literally using the entire ocean to adjust Earth's temperature and plan for a world of 200 billion, billion with a B. And you could see another farm there on the left with a guy named Hall, who imagined most of the West Coast becoming a kelp farm. And finally, I followed this into contemporary art with a guy named Peter Fend, who picked up these ideas in the 70s and ran with them. Okay, that's me. I went a little long, but thank you. Thank you.
All right, so thank you to the four panelists. I think that one of the fun things about these sort of humanities panels is enjoying the opportunity to see connections across presentations. So we welcome any questions for, again, a specific presenter, or if you see a theme recurring across several, we'll welcome that. Yes.
You mentioned how the big kelp really grows well. It needs like cold and nutrient-dense water. Have we noticed or done any research towards kelp that is evolving to deal with warmer temperatures and or hybridizing that ourselves?
That's a great question. In fact, yes, to answer that shortly. It's being done now by many different scientists, but it also was done many years ago as well. So Wheeler North actually brought kelp from Baja to San Diego and grew it there. And so there's some genetic work happening now that I'd be really curious to see if any of those kelp plants actually persisted and hybridized in some way. But so there was interest in looking to see if we can create this kelp forest that is better adapted to warmer waters.
Thank you. Other questions? I have one. Okay, I think this is actually a really nice moment to ask the panel about their thoughts on documentary images. So the documentary image often has a reputation for being neutral, objective, just documenting, not having a kind of intention behind it. But I think some of the examples that you shared today across several presentations present a different kind of story about documentary images. So I was wondering if you might share some thoughts on that.
I'll start. Thank you so much, Melody, for organizing panel and also this question. So maybe I'll just talk a little bit about Edward Curtis' photographs that I showed at the end. So he was interested in the concept of vanishing race. So indigenous populations in the 19th century vanishing to disappearing, right? But in fact, they're thriving. They have persevered, right? Evidence of resilience. But the seaweed that were also documented have disappeared or disappearing. So I'm wondering whether what he documented is more than the people. It's the environment, the ecology that the people belong to and were steward to. So I'm interested in rereading the documentary photographs. Same goes for the photograph I showed of Hawaii. There is this stereotype of lazy Hawaiians not really working. Seaweed gathering was both productive exercise as well as cultural exercise of intergenerational conversations and storytelling and singing, right? So the work versus like play, the binary did not exist in Hawaiian culture as the picture kind of showed.
It's such a rich question, and especially dealing with, in my case, with photographs that were made with particular military objectives and reproduce a lot of the stereotypes that, Sol is speaking to. And I think that I'm also really interested in how do you read against the grain of those sets of intentions, the way the images circulate, and it's challenging. In some ways, like I also struggle with that, the bind you get stuck in, where you actually, through the archive, you reproduce a lot of those tendencies that are just inscribed in the images themselves. In my case, like, I know all about Claude Adams because there's extensive military records about him. I don't know anything about any of the individuals that are represented in that collection of images. But I think that, not only through your work, but many others too, Melody, that's like, it's one of the ways that I try to press on the whether alternative histories or and also the liveliness of the images that still is continuous throughout the and maybe resistant of that objectifying gaze.
I'm no historian, but yeah. So I do take photos, and so I think that taking photos and documenting what's happening now is really important, so that you can see people in the future can actually see what maybe changes are happening over time. One of our monitoring protocols is a video monitoring. So we just go along our transect line and video the transect, and we're able to track changes over time just visually on that. And that's actually really compelling to see those changes, even if the person doesn't want to get into the nitty-gritty of the data. They can watch these videos and see a healthy kelp forest go to an urchin barren and then back to a kelp forest.
The small piece I can add is the beautiful Caldenning maps that Keenan showed were spurred by a national interest in obtaining potash. Most potash was coming from Germany. Potash importers tried to work with the potash syndicate in Germany to bring prices down. This produced a diplomatic crisis, and then the federal government said, okay, we need to search for a domestic source of potash. So that's some of the, it's definitely part of nationalism and security and stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other audience questions for a panelist or that cut across the panelists? Okay, so the last panel went 15 minutes late, so I'm going to take until 1:10, and you're free to go if you like, but I'm going to ask one more question. So I'm getting from David's presentation and others, like at the time you're looking in the 60s and 70s, there's this real sense that seaweed was the future. But that's a long time ago now. So how long has seaweed been the future for? We're thinking about seaweed in relation to time in these different ways, like sort of this deep time look at seaweed with Keenan's presentation and Sol's particularly. But there's these different moments in the past that have seen seaweeds as the future. So I'm just curious, like if you have thoughts or anyone on the panel has thoughts on this kind of perception of like how long seaweeds have been the future for.
I don't know if I have a specific answer, but I've been thinking about that in materialist terms, and like I think part of it is something to do with seaweed reproduction, and that it's reproducing in a water medium. It reproduces extremely fast. It has these ambient properties of reproduction, and I think this is its reproductive capacity is like its capacity at the micro level to sort of exponentially produce. It's partly fueled these world-making dreams in the 20th century. I haven't fully wrestled with this, but that's where I'm going. But I think it really takes off in the mid 20th century, but it surely must have earlier precedents.
I'll maybe try to modify that a little bit to say that maybe it's that seaweed's sense of futurity, which I think is very much tied to a project of modernity, really comes from, I think, more that it's a panacea for the problems of the present in many ways, right? Like it's
help
always
can help,
right.
Yeah.
It's a kind of there's a sort of solutionist attitude that I think really is consistent, probably across several centuries at least. And like I think of even Sol, mentioned the particular relationship to iodine, right? The seaweed and iodine as a medical panacea in 19th century Europe in many ways. Iodine is also iodine derives from seaweed was also crucial to the development of photography itself. Iodine being used as one of the constituent chemical or part of the constituent chemicals to sensitize early photographic plates, right? So that it kind of is connected to technical, medical, even cultural solutions that are always about tied to a sort of modernizing project.
That's great. Thank you.
I guess something that I would also like to add is there's so much that we still don't know about the seaweed, and that kind of provokes the imagination. It's still the frontier for so many other industries, so many aspects of our life, as you talked about. Like it's the idea of panacea still remains because we still don't know so much about the ocean as terra-centric animals that we are. As Melody, you talk about in your book that we can't breathe in the water, right? So we can't function as humans in the water as we do on land. So the unknowability is double-edged sword, I think. Yeah, it triggers imagination, fantasies in both like generative and problematic ways.
And there's some nice stickers outside that have some of these slogans on them too, like seaweed is the solution, or yeah. Yeah.
One thing that came to mind is that if you, in the 19th century, when Darwin is thinking about the kelp forests, you get this, you get kelp as a figure of a domesticating force in the environment. It plays an outsized role in an ecosystem. It produces habitat for other species. And I think it's seen as an agent, as like a thing that worlds, which gets sort of picked up in the 20th century with ideas of ecosystem engineering or a foundation species. I think, we also see ourselves in giant kelp as a organism that modifies its world.
I think that's a really nice note to end on, unless Keenan, you have any thoughts to add here. So kelp has brought us all together. It has created this small pocket of a world for a day. So thank you for all coming today. And please join me in a round of applause for our presenters.